Hey YouTube, as we know there's a lot of media attention on developments in the Middle East. This is my attempt at providing some geopolitical insight into the current situation in the region. I'm definitely not an expert, but this video is supposed to convey my understanding based on some books and articles I have read. Okay, let's start. The Arab Spring is definitely the center of current developments. To understand the background to this movement and some of the forces that are acting behind the scenes, we have to look at some history. The once mighty Ottoman Empire finally fell on November the 1st, 1922, after 600 years. So even before that, with the defeat of the Ottomans by the Allied forces, the British and French governments had a secret agreement called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which would carve out the Arab portion of the empire between them. With the Ottomans out of the picture in the 1920s, they were the de facto rulers over much of the Middle East. This was the map in the 1920s and 30s. The French had much of modern-day Syria, Lebanon, and northern Iraq. The British had southern Iraq, which connected them to the crown jewel in India, Egypt, and mandatory Palestine. You'll see Egypt's not part of the British Dominion on the map. That's because the Kingdom of Egypt was a short-lived protectorate that ended in 1922. The international zone was the Palestinian Mandate before partition in 1948. Now, to understand the independence of Egypt and the partition of Palestine, we have to take in effect the rise of Arab nationalism. Now, Arab nationalism has existed since the late end of the Ottoman Empire. The Arab populace in various parts of the mandatories and protectorates under the French and British were not satisfied with the status quo at this point, since they were supported by the British and French during the Ottoman Empire. So they felt betrayed by their former supporters, since they were the ones that were carving out their land. And tensions got higher when the Legislative Council of Palestine was elected in 1922, and the Arabs only had 43% of the seats, while they composed 88% of the population. This frustration eventually led to full-scale revolt, first in Iraq in 1920, then in Syria in 1925, and finally in Palestine in 1936. They were eventually recognized as independent kingdoms at the dates given on the map. But Palestine wasn't partitioned until 1948 because of the complicated relationship between the Jewish and Arab populace. There were ongoing hostilities even before the United Nations partition plan between Jewish and Arab forces in Palestine. So when the State of Israel was founded on May 14, 1948, surrounding Arab states immediately invaded Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, which formed the newly founded Arab League, initially attempted to encircle Israel on multiple fronts. Israel repelled these invasions, and an armistice agreement was signed 9 months later. At the end of the war, Israel allotted its captured territory in the West Bank to Jordan and the Gaza Strip to Egypt. Israel's victory resulted in the infamous 1948 Palestinian Exodus. The rank-and-file Arab soldier put the blame on this defeat on the top brass. The top brass was part of the aristocracy of these Arab kingdoms, which was increasingly seen as despotic and corrupt. So on July 23, 1952, the Free Officers Movement in Egypt, led by Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser, led a coup d'etat against the kingdom and established the Republic of Egypt. Eventually other Arab states followed suit, where there was a coup in 1963 in Syria, 1968 in Iraq, and 1969 in Libya. At this point, the Middle East was an arena between the Soviet Union and the United States in the Cold War. After banning all opposition and establishing a one-party system, Abdel Nasser became the first president of the Republic of Egypt. He embarked on a major industrialization and agrarian reform project. He understood the importance of the Suez Canal. However, the British had the majority share of the Suez Canal Company and a military complex near the vicinity. The advantage of the canal was immense. It was the focal point of trade between 3 continents, and it was the gateway to the vast oil reserves of the Mideast. Nasser pursued a non-alignment policy by making overtures to the Soviet Union and recognizing the People's Republic of China. This alienated Western powers, and they soon withdrew support of the construction of an Egyptian dam. This gave the perfect justification to seize the Suez Canal, and on July 26, 1956, that's exactly what he did. After nationalizing the Suez Canal, Nasser blockaded the Strait of Tiran, which cut off Israeli vessels from the Red Sea and routes to the Indian Ocean. British, French, and Israeli forces counteracted in Operation Kadesh. Israeli columns advanced into Sinai, while British and French Marines were launching amphibious assaults onto Port Said at the mouth of the canal. After some pitched fighting, Israeli and British forces had to withdraw due to American pressure and a deployment of United Nations emergency force. After the ceasefire, Egypt reopened the Strait of Tiran, and the British withdrew their assets from the area permanently. This was not an isolated incident, as other Mideast states tried to nationalize assets and resources that were dominated by foreign powers. Iran in the 1950s was ruled by a constitutional monarchy. In 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh was the first elected Prime Minister of Iran. He in turn nationalized the British-owned oil industry of the country, but unlike Nasser, he wasn't so lucky, as he wasn't able to play the Cold War rivals against each other. This resulted in economic sanctions, and the alleged threat of a Soviet takeover of the oil industry persuaded the Eisenhower administration to launch a CIA operation to stage a coup d'etat against Mossadegh. This put the Pahlavi dynasty back in power, where it ruled with an iron grip for the next 26 years. So back in Egypt, after the Suez Crisis, Nasser was hailed as the hero of Arab nationalism. He initiated the next phase of his nationalist policy called Pan-Arabism. This ideology espouses the unification or close cooperation of all Arab states. This was put into practice by the formation of the United Arab Republic in 1958. Even though this only included Egypt and Syria, the Ba'ath Party of Syria and the nationalist regime in Egypt argued this was the only way to stop the spread of communism in the Arab world. This union quickly fell apart in 1961 because of the bureaucratic strain of governing two nations and Nasser's refusal of sharing power with the Ba'ath Party. This got worse as elections in Syria were rigged to replace the Ba'ath Party. Though a clear failure, the idea of a united Arab world would influence a later movement. The Syrian Ba'ath Party held a socialist doctrine which stated that the state should be led by a revolutionary vanguard. Mikhail Aflaq, a member of the Syrian Ba'ath Party, argued for a civilian vanguard, while a faction led by Hafez al-Assad argued for military control. Tensions between the factions culminated in the 1966 Syrian coup, which placed the current Assad family in power, while in Iraq, the Aflaq doctrine continued with Saddam Hussein until 2003. This sort of disharmony between the Arab states didn't bode well for them during the 1967 Six-Day War. This war was a response to the guerrilla activity of the Palestinian Liberation Operation. There were Syrian and Jordanian elements in the guerrilla operations, and allegations on both sides of warmongering and heightened tension brought Arab armies near Israel's border. Israel acted quickly and grounded the Egyptian Air Force and maintained complete air superiority and managed to capture the West Banks, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights in Syria in a matter of 6 days. Regardless of what might think of the Israeli regime, we cannot deny their stunning victory. Needless to say, this war was humiliating to the Arab world, and worse for the Palestinian people, for their part of the partition shrunk after the war. Now, shortly after the war, Nasser died of a sudden heart attack in 1970. He was succeeded by his colleague Anwar Sadat, who reintroduced the multi-party system in Egypt and sought support of the Muslim Brotherhood. I will explain their origins later on. Now, Egypt was propelled in yet another war with Israel in 1973 to reclaim the Sinai Peninsula that was lost in 1967. After some initial Egyptian and Syrian success, Israel managed to win a tactical victory on the ground, and the IDF crossed the Suez Canal and encircled the Egyptian Second Army. With the imminent annihilation of the Second Army and the Soviet threat of intervention, the United Nations enforced a ceasefire. Sadat understood that he couldn't engage Israel militarily, so he initiated peace talks with American officials, including Henry Kissinger, who helped negotiate the end of the 1973 war, and with Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and on September 17, 1978, with the assistance of the Carter administration in America, Egypt and Israel signed the Camp David's Accord that is kept to this day. Despite winning the Nobel Peace Prize, Sadat was not popular in the greater Arab world, since they thought he betrayed the Arab cause against Zionism. The Arab League actually went ahead and expelled Egypt on 1979, and on the 6th October 1981 he was assassinated by rogue elements of the Muslim Brotherhood. To understand the next era of Mideast politics, we need to look at the ideology of Islamism. Islam has always been a part of Mideast politics, but modern Islamism began in the 1950s with the writing of the Egyptian thinker Sayyid Qutb. Qutb had an interest in teaching at a young age, so he visited the United States for studies in education. The culture shock was too much for him, as he was dismayed by what he saw as the decadent materialism of American culture. The culture shock fine-tuned his Islamic identity, and when he arrived back in Egypt, he was determined not to let this happen to Egypt. Qutb joined the already influential Muslim Brotherhood and became its main spokesman. Nasser, however, already opposed the Brotherhood from the beginning, and when an assassination attempt by a Brotherhood activist failed in 1954, this gave him the opportunity to ban the Brotherhood and imprison thousands of his members, including Qutb. Meanwhile, in Iran, the writings of Ruhollah Khomeini had a similar effect. He spent the last 15 years of his life in exile and wrote extensively about a state ruled by the guardianship of the Jewish consulate, or Velayat al-Fiqh. Though the revolution of 1979 was partly secular, Khomeini emerged as the leader of the Iranian Revolution. He fashioned himself as a prophesied 12th Imam of the Shia Islamic faith, and on 9th December 1979 he was declared as the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. When he came into power and established his model of a theocratic government, he crushed all opposition and established a state apparatus that was even more repressive than that of the Shah. Now, Iran after the revolution was surrounded by hostile states. The Sunni Gulf states to the south viewed Iran with suspicion, and relations with Afghanistan to the east deteriorated after the Soviet incursion into the region. The Soviet Union itself was an ally to Iran's biggest threat, Saddam Hussein. Saddam's government was dominated by Sunnis, and while Shias and other minorities composed the underclass of his regime. He was notoriously known for the brutal suppression of Kurdish and Shia movements in Iraq. So when Khomeini urged the Shia revolution, Saddam saw it as an existential threat to Iraq. With all the nationalist rhetoric he invoked before going to war, the practical reason was to control the vast oil fields on the other side of the Iranian border. A key choke point was the Shatt al-Arab waterway, a key channel for oil exports for both countries, which was disputed since the Ba'ath Party came to power. What came about was a long war of attrition because of Iran's sheer size and rugged terrain. This was the longest conventional war of the 20th century. The US didn't outrightly favor one side over another, but the US Navy engaged Iran to clear the disputed waterways, which was vital to the American economy. This would set the stage for future Iranian antagonism towards the US. In 1988, only after the use of vicious chemical weapons on civilians forced both sides to accept the UN Security Council resolution ceasefire. Despite this long struggle, nothing was resolved. Saddam tried to ease the debt accumulated from the war by invading Kuwait. He justified it by some excuse about Kuwait not meeting the international quota for oil production, which resulted in a drop of oil prices in Iraq. A UN-authorized coalition force led by the United States was summoned and repelled the invasion with relative ease. The United States understood at this point that Saddam was a nuisance. Back in Egypt, Qutb was tried and hanged for treason. he was succeeded by the Egyptian doctor Ayman Zawahiri. Zawahiri constructed the political goals of Islamism. He believed he was part of a vanguard movement that would lead an Islamic revolution in Egypt and eventually the entire Mideast. This was similar to Pan-Arabism, but Pan-Islamism would require the creation of a caliphate that would unite the entire Islamic world. His arrest and torture for an attempted coup in Egypt radicalized him even further. He then met Osama bin Laden in Saudi Arabia. Together they traveled to Pakistan to raise funds and recruit members for a Mujahideen base. The base brought people from across the Arab world to fight the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The Mujahideen also found support from the Reagan administration, which was part of Reagan's strategic plan to roll back the spread of communism. After the Soviets left, the Arab Mujahideen went back to their respective countries to initiate a revolution there. What they found was the harsh reality of the situation. The Middle East in the 1990s was struggling from economic stagnation and harsh political repression. The economy failed to diversify, and they were dependent on oil production. Mideast society at this point became increasingly conservative due to the spread of Wahhabism from Saudi Arabia, which was funded by millions of dollars of oil revenue. Wahhabism composed of a strict interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah. Islamism now got their doctrinal support from Wahhabism, otherwise known as Salafism. There are other tolerant forms of Islam, but the Wahhabi sect did not welcome opposing views. The dangerous mixture of poverty, repression, and religious conservatism made the Mideast into a breeding ground for militant Islam. The militants now thought that violence was the only way to lead a revolution. This led to horrific consequences in Algeria, where militant violence and government reprisals led to hundreds of thousands of people being killed. This is also true in Palestine, where the PLO leader Yasser Arafat attempted peace talks with Israel at the Oslo Accords in 1993. This brought the ire of the Islamist Hamas movement, who spent as much time fighting the secular leadership in the West Bank, as well as insurgency against Israel. The militants now knew that the power of their local dictators derived from the United States. As a response, a terrorist cell drove a truck containing explosives into the basement of the North Tower in 1993. Then again on August 7, 1998, another terrorist cell bombed US embassies in Nairobi, Kenya and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The Clinton administration at the time did not overtly respond to these events. It wasn't until the destruction of the World Trade Center in September 11, 2001 that the United States was propelled into the war against terror. The media at this time depicted this as a clash of civilization, but in reality it was a war against a splintering political movement that had become extremely sour after decades of repression. The administration at the time used the current interest in the Mideast to focus on Iraq. The administration accused Saddam of possessing weapons of mass destruction. However, the geopolitical goal of the Iraq War was probably to remove an unpredictable regime that was threatening US interest in the region. So 3 weeks after the start of Operation Iraqi Freedom, Saddam's government fell. After Saddam was toppled, former regime insurgents and militant Islamists began targeting US soldiers and security forces. Later in 2006, Shia and Sunni militants began a savage war of insurgency that rocked Iraqi society. Iraqi civilians were usually the victims of these attacks, as the security situation became increasingly unstable. Because of the huge human toll of the war and the current political instability, the US invasion of Iraq was an utter strategic disaster. The current struggle between Shias and Sunnis is also a geopolitical one. Iran has been criticized for its nuclear program, and especially for the strong rhetoric against Israel. Because of their ideology of revolutionary Shiism, Saudi Arabia and nearby Gulf states see them as a threat. In reality, Iran's economy has been slowed down due to decades of international sanctions, and they are increasingly isolated diplomatically. The Strait of Hormuz is right between the Gulf states and Iran. 20% of the world's petroleum goes through the strait, making it an indispensable choke point. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states rely on the US Navy in the area to protect this small shipping lane. Indeed, the Revolutionary Guard of Iran threatened to close the strait in the event of an attack from the US or Israel. This shipping lane is a fault line that might be the source of future conflict. Now we go back to Egypt. As we now know, what happens in Egypt affects the rest of the Middle East. The assassination of Anwar Sadat made a deep impression on his successor, Hosni Mubarak. Mubarak set up a security apparatus notorious for its abuse and brutality. Like the rest of the Middle East, Egypt was struggling with a weak economy. The Egyptians had to deal with poverty, police abuse, and the threat of Islamist violence. To put it lightly, they were stuck between a rock and a hard place. So when the street vendor Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire in Tunisia, this unleashed outrage against the status quo, first in Tunisia, then in Egypt, on January 25, 2011. Indeed, the protests in Tahrir Square opened the window to the protests across the region. An interesting event that wasn't well covered by the mainstream media was the Bahraini uprising. This was an uprising against the royal family of Bahrain. Bahrain is a tiny island situated in the Persian Gulf, and the royal family and administration is Sunni, while Shias make up the majority of the population. The protesters urged the equal treatment of Shias and fair and free elections. The Gulf Cooperation Council, made up of nearby Sunni states, used the excuse of a supposed Iranian-led espionage to deploy troops in Bahrain to crush the uprising. My condolences to the brave people of Bahrain in this uprising. But there is a possibility of Iranian interference in the protests, since this island state is in the fault line between the Gulf states and Iran. The Syrian uprising started with non-violent protests that eventually led to a full-scale civil war. To understand this struggle, we have to look at the geopolitical situation. Syria is under the overlapping influence of Iran and Russia. Russia is an up-and-coming economic power that is a key supporter of the Assad regime and an arms dealer to the region. Iran uses the Mesopotamian region and Syria as a conduit to support the Islamist Hezbollah party in Lebanon. The reason why Western powers are hesitant to intervene in Syria because that would mean facing a resurgent Russia and a desperate Iran. The practical reason for support for both powers is to possibly have access to the shipping lanes in the Eastern Mediterranean. Whatever happens in the current struggle in Syria, there will be a vacuum of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. That would explain why the Russian Navy was deployed off the coast of Syria earlier this year in June. They called it a naval exercise, but it is clear that this is a display of power in the region. Today, Turkey has a surging economy, and they are considered an up-and-coming regional power. They may influence the Palestinian issue, since they are considered a friendly state to both Israel and Palestine. But they may also clash with Russia and the Caucasus region because of the support of Georgia. But for now, this is simply speculation. With that, I conclude my analysis on the region. If I have gotten anything wrong, or missed anything, please let me know in the comment section. The last thing I want to talk about is religious fundamentalism. If you are a liberal Muslim or a secularist and you're concerned about the current wave of religious fundamentalism in the Middle East, there are some small steps we can take to counter it. We can support the Green Movement or the Solidarity with Iran movement, or we can sign a petition for the release of people like Hamza Kashgari, who is awaiting trial for supposed blasphemy. I have put the relevant links in the description box. So, thank you for watching and take care.